Hello everyone, and welcome to part 12 of our Hackolade tutorial. In this part, we're going to be talking about how you can use the Hackolade Studio to create a REST API model for your APIs using a visual and schema-centric approach. Right? So we're going to be developing Swagger or OpenAPI specification for those APIs without you having to know the Swagger or OpenAPI syntaxes. Right? But of course, it will help you if you understand and know the features of those different specifications. It fits really well with an API first and design first process, right? Which is why we also think that in many cases, this type of API development is going to fit really well with NoSQL data stores, right? Access patterns and APIs are very often aligned, right? And the data models that you use in order to fit those access patterns are going to be aligned. So therefore, there's a natural alignment between API development and NoSQL data store development. Right? So these things are really fitting hand in glove. So it helps a lot to use this type of approach to understand existing APIs as well. Why? Because you're going to be visually representing how these Swagger or OpenAPI files actually document the interaction between your software and that API. So we can use the Hackolade Studio not only to develop these APIs, but also to better understand them and reverse engineer them into a data model that is much more easier for you to work with. We're going to be focusing mostly on OpenAPI, but the principles behind this will also apply to Swagger. The example that we'll be using is something that we've probably all used, a URL shortener, right? A service where you can send a full URL, let's say something that you get from, I don't know, some Google search or an Amazon search or something like that, right? And that will turn that long URL into a short slug that is much easier to share and copy and paste into your documentation or emails or whatever, right? So first we generate the short slug, and then of course we will also be able to do the reverse, which is that when we send the slug to the service, it will give us back the full URL. It's inspired by many of the existing services out there, but Shorty was the name of the one that we originally used here. Right, so the output of this effort is going to be a visual description of the API, right? A visual explanation of the API. You will see it later on, obviously. But we're also going to be generating the corresponding API files, right? The documentation files that describe this in a formal way, right? So you'll see that as well. You can use Hackolade both to reverse engineer these files or to generate these files based on the model that we create for the API. When we design the API, then obviously what we're going to try and do is we're going to put ourselves into the shoes of the consumer and make it easy to understand and navigate what this person or this system is doing, right? And we do that usually with a sequence diagram, right? Where on the left-hand side here, you see the first process where someone creates an entry using a full URL and receives the short slug back that is generated by the service. And on the right-hand side, you see the second process, which is where someone sends a slug to the service and gets back the full URL, right? When we start doing this, I would argue that the sequence in which you are going to do this is actually quite important. There's a number of tutorials out there that are going to start with the information, then generate the paths, then generate the components, but we actually recommend that you start with the foundation, which is the schema that describes the structure of the service and the service contract between producer and consumer. So therefore, the process that we are going to follow here is that we first are going to create the reusable components, which is the schema, the request body, using the schema, the parameters that you're going to use to fetch the full URL from a slug, the responses, and the OAuth to security scheme. Then we're also going to create the resources with the requests and responses. We'll add an endpoint, add tags, add some metadata information, but also make it visually a little bit more interesting and meaningful using color coding. And then finally, we're going to be generating the OpenAPI file with API testing so that you can take this into your development process later on. So let's get stuck in. Let's use the Hackolade Studio now and start developing our OpenAPI. So here we go. We're going to create a new model, and that new model is going to be an OpenAPI model, obviously. The first thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating some reusable components, and we have the structure laid out for us here already. We'll just give it a meaningful name here, and then we can get started. And the first thing that we'll be focusing on is, of course, the schema components. We actually just need two schemas, one for the happy flow and then one for the error messages. So let's add those. Just adding an object over here. That's going to be my URL object. And then in that URL object, I will be creating two parts to it, one of them being a string, and that will be my long URL. And the other one is going to be also a string, and that's going to be the slug that we need over here. And now here, I'm going to be adding another object, right? I'm going to recreate another object over here, which is going to be my error object. And the error object is going to have the first field that is a number, and that number is going to be a float that is a status code. Yep. And then I'm going to add one more here, which is a string that is going to be the message. Right. So, and with that, we have the first schema components ready for our exchange. You also note that if you have any kind of experience already with complex schemas defined in other Hackolade target data models, you can also reference those as external references so that they can be kept in sync with the master version for higher data quality and consistency. And the next thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating the request body, right? And that means right-clicking over here, and then it will actually generate the structure that we need as a template that is created to guide you through this entire process with standard media type and applications and all of the structure. So let's edit this. The first thing that we'll do here is we will rename this as the URL body. And then also we will replace the schema here with an object reference of a schema component that we created earlier, right? So we do that over here by replacing this with the URL component that we have, and therefore this edits this in the way that you see over here now. You may wonder why the slug is also in the request body. Well, that's because of a feature of the service that is to allow the end user to specify a preferred custom slug as well as a random system assigned slug. To allow the former, we need to provide a field for it along with the long URL. And an advantage of this is that the same schema can be used both for the request and for the response. We also want to give our users some examples to better understand how to use the API, for example, with the summary, right? So here we add an attribute, which is an example attribute, and this will be a custom example, right? And here we also add another example, which is a random one, right? So we can add these, right? And you can add values to them where necessary. So that's it for now. It's also possible to create multiple component request bodies to pick from in your requests. Next, we will follow a very similar set of steps to create the parameter that will be used in the second use case when submitting a slug in order to retrieve the full URL. Here we will choose a path. And in other APIs, you might also choose a query or a header or a cookie. So here's how we do that, right? We just add a path parameter here. We will call this the slug, right? And that will have a schema, a content, and examples associated with it as well. Next, we are going to right-click the responses component and add a response template here, right? So here we go. And that will be how we create a response structure. We're going to start with a good response, which is 200 OK, right? We will give it a description here, which will be successful operation, right? Apply that. And then we also will be clicking here on the schema box and replacing that with the schema that we referenced earlier, right? So we're going to be saying, okay, replace this with a component which is the one that we had earlier. So now we have that component schema referenced, as you can see. And we will do something very similar here for the generic error message, right? So this is going to be our error message. And the similar thing to do here is to go to the schema and to replace this with a component which is the error component that we had created earlier, right? So that's it. We now have our responses set up, and next thing we're going to be doing is we're going to be specifying the security scheme for our API, and we'll use the auth2 mechanism to do that. So here I'm going to add an attribute which is going to be a security scheme, right? And that is going to be my auth2. And I can actually go in here and specify the subtype and add a few flows here. Like for example, the authentication codes, I can add the authorization URL and the token URL here, for example. So I've just copied those in there. And I can also add the scopes here, right? So this one will be the slugs. And then from there on, we can actually proceed by creating resources with requests and responses, which is what we're going to do next. So we're done now with the creation of the reusable components, right? And so now we're going to switch to our API model and assemble these components into resource paths, right? So we do that over here. We're going to add a resource, right? And we're going to give that a name, right? So this is the URLs resource path. And we're going to be adding a request in the box here, right? So the request here is going to be a post request, right? So I have to select that over here. And then we can start editing that over here. Right, so we can edit the description here, shorten a URL, for example, right? And also we can add some responses here, right? So I'm going to add a couple of responses here. So this one over here is going to be our 200 OK response, right? And then I'm going to do something similar here. I'll add another one, which is the 400 response. Right, so bad request, and I'll add one more, which is the 403, right? So I'll select that over here, forbidden, right? And now we already have a nice little structure that we can proceed with. It's also a good practice here to add a tag to our post here. So we're going to call that the URLs tag here. Let's write that correctly. And now the easiest way for us to create the structure of a request is to go into a dedicated tab, right, where the template is automatically created. And there are obviously different ways to build a request, all represented in the template. In our case, we will be replacing the schema object with a reusable component that we created earlier by now going here into the schema, right, and saying, I'm going to replace this with the URL body, right, so it's this one over here. I'm going to replace it with the component, right, which is the URL body, right. So now this URL body is actually going to be the request body for this particular request. We also created the examples here of a custom slug and a random slug, which will help the developer visualize the possible inputs here. And by the way, if you ever need a request body here that, or a response that is different from its original definition, you can actually break the link with the definition by right-clicking there and choosing here, replace by attributes. Right? So then you can do your modifications, but you should also be aware that the object will no longer be updated if the original component evolves. Now let's go back to our responses over here, and we'll start editing those a little bit. Right? So it's easier to just open those up into a separate schema tab, obviously. Right? So we'll go right here and edit the schema that I have over here. Right? The schema over there, we should reference that replace it by a URL component, right? So that's the URL component that we need here, the long URL and the slug, right? And we'll do something similar here, a little bit lower as well. We're going to go back into our 400 here as well and update the schema for that because that's an error code, right? So we're going to be replacing the reference here, right? We're going to go back again to the 403, right? And edit that schema and replace it by a component as well, right? Which is going to be the error component over there, right? So that's all quite easy, right? If we now get out of these tabs and go back here, then we have our resulting API that is visually quite understandable. I can actually go here and make it a little bit more appealing by saying, well, this is the positive one, right? The 400 is the negative one, right? And the 403, yeah, let's give that an orange color because that's the security forbidden error message, isn't it? Right, so that's it. We've got a great API fully developed now for the first use case, and we can do something very similar for the second use case now. So I will start over here and add another resource for that, right? And that resource is going to be a, I need to edit it over here, right? It's going to be the URLs and then the slug resource that I'm going to be adding here, right? In that resource, I'm going to have a request, right? Which is going to be a GET request, right? And that GET request is going to have a number of responses as well. I'll add 2 responses here, right? And now this one is going to be our 200, okay. And this one is going to be our 404, not found, right? So now we can start editing this a little bit more. I'll give this one its appropriate color, right? So that's the green one, and this one is the orange one, right? So that we make it very clear here. And also open this up, right? And edit the schema for the 200 response here, right? Because that is going to be a reference as well to our URL component. Right, so that's great. Now I'm going to do something similar to our 404 here, right? The 404 has a schema that's also going to be referencing a component that we already have in place, right? Which is going to be the error component that we already know from our previous work, right? So now we have the structure of this resource and its requests and responses also in place, and you can see how it becomes visually quite attractive, right, to very quickly understand the exchanges, right? We can obviously edit this a little bit more, but let's wrap it up with a couple of finishing touches. So I've added a bunch of properties here in the properties tab of our URL shortener. And now if we click on the lower tab here, we can also generate the OpenAPI documentation file. On the left-hand side, we see the generated JSON or YAML syntax for the API that we just created with the application. And we also have an onboard validator that verifies the compliance with the OpenAPI specification. Right? You can copy the text and paste it into your API process or into your Swagger editor or leverage server and client code generation to make best use of this. And you can also obviously forward engineer this, right? And forward engineer this into an OpenAPI file of your preference. Don't forget also that this, all of this functionality is available in your command line interface, right? So there's a forward engineering capability in the command line interface that allows you to integrate this file generation into your CI/CD pipeline if that would be appropriate. All right, I think that's it for now. So let's head back to our slides for now. Great, now that we have gone through that entire process, I'd like to wrap up this part 12 of our tutorial. And we're going to do that by just coming back to a couple of points that could be important for you. First of all, we know that the way that we have gone about the creation of this API and the way that we've integrated it into a modeling environment may generate some debate. You know, some people are big fans of code first API development, which is obviously not something that we believe is very helpful. We think that design first is going to help you think through all of the details, make sure that you understand and discuss all of your alternatives and different approaches with your stakeholders, understand what the impacts are of the choices that you make there, and therefore also have a much more advantageous way of developing this API. The cost will be lower, the quality will be higher, it will be easier to evolve it, and hopefully also easier to realize and get to value, right? So we actually believe that design first is the way to go about API development, and that's why we made the inclusion of API development into our Hackolade Studio modeling tool such an important part and such an important area of attention. You know, we believe that there's a lot of people that are supporting this, and therefore we warmly recommend that you read up on it. And you know, there's a couple of articles linked here, but we're also going to refer you back to, you know, the reading material that we also always include at the end of this these tutorials. You know, there's a lot of great documentation on our website, our blog. We have a fantastic book out. We have LinkedIn and social and Twitter pages, and we highly, highly recommend that you take a look at it yourself. Don't believe our word for it, and download the Hackolade Studio and get going with it. If you would have any questions, then obviously reach out. If not, I'm going to thank you for paying attention to this tutorial and wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.